Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar on how to organize your code from CAL moving to AL. My name's Andrius. I'm a senior developer at OneClick Factory, and my main responsibilities is overseeing and executing projects when we move actually from CAL to AL. Today, we're going to talk about what can we do in the existing system, in the existing language, in the existing environment, if we want to move to the new version of Business Central, to the new language, as seamless as possible. So that will include how to handle standard object modifications, what to do with the standard objects, do we need to do anything with the custom objects, and we'll have a short demo on how to make assessments slightly easier. Some housekeeping rules. So if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to drop those questions in the chat. We will see all the questions, and at the end of the webinar, I will answer them as thoroughly as I can. So let's get started with why do we want to do that in CAL in the first place? So why can't we just convert everything as is to AL and continue from there? So first of all, we are familiar with the development environment. We are familiar with the language, with all the limitations, and there is no learning curve, when we want to do any changes. It is a lot safer to do the code refactoring that you will need to do before moving to Business Central. Most of you probably don't have automated tests in place, so that means you can only know by gut that the change you will make will not break anything. And every change that you have done and tested will be tested again in your existing system, in the live system. So you will know that you're not influenced by the new language limitations. You're not impacted by the new Business Central functionality in any way, so that the things you have done while preparing to move work exactly as expected. And when moving, if you decide to move straight to AL, there will be quite a big overhead, because if something doesn't work, then you have to figure out if it's an old bug that you have not encountered before. Maybe it's a conversion issue, maybe it's a merge issue, or maybe this is the way the new Business Central executes the business logic. And on top of all that, you will get tons of warnings, which doesn't help when developing. So your current state looks probably the same as on the screen. So you have a bunch of standard objects in your solution, you have some customized objects, you have some modified objects. So what do we do with all these three groups? So with standard objects, we can actually leave them as is. There is no need to do anything specifically with them. If you do have time and resources, we suggest to look into what is obsolete. So make sure that your functionality does not rely on any functionality that does not exist in the next version. You should also try and check what functionality will become obsolete in the near future. Probably the best example would be sales and price management, which is marked as obsolete in the version 16 of the Business Central. That means in the next version, you won't be able to utilize those code units, those tables. So you have to cater for that when you are refactoring your code. Also, it is quite useful to have a look at the new functionality. For example, if you are currently on the NAV 2013 R2 and you have a functionality that handles item attributes that was introduced in NAV 2017. So maybe you can get rid of your functionality and use the standard one, extend the standard one, and get exactly the same result. Quite often we get the question from partners how to get what is obsolete and what is obsolete pending. So there are two ways. So for the system app, you can use GitHub. It is really good documented list of things that Microsoft has changed over time, which is no longer supported, which has been refactored. For the base app, for the actual functionality, unfortunately, you will have to look into the code. Microsoft's idea is, even though the functionality is obsolete, it still is in place. It is just marked as obsolete, so you can just search for the tags obsolete and you will see what is Microsoft already discontinued or discontinuing in the near future. With custom objects, so that means the objects that you have created, again, you don't have to do anything in particular, although there are some things that you could do that would make your life easier after you convert everything to AL. One of the major things is add an affix. Affix, basically, when you are converting your solution to AL, and especially if you're planning to go to SaaS, you have to have either prefix or suffix for every single object that you have created. And the limitation of 30 symbols still applies, so you might have to rename your objects to include the prefix and suffix and not exceed those 30 symbols. Another really useful thing is to centralize the usage of things you will need to refactor in AL. So that involves .NET, that involves JSON, that involves handling XML documents, handling web requests and files. We do have native types in AL for JSON, XML, and web services. So if you want to make your life easier in AL, put them somewhere in one place, so you would only have to modify that and everything will work as expected. You should start thinking what to do with the .NET components. So any custom libraries should be refactored to most likely using Azure functions, because .NET is not allowed in SaaS. If you have any control add-ins, you have to start thinking on how to refactor those using JavaScript. Again, when it comes to the file usage, how you're using it. Maybe you have batch invoicing that you run every single night and you store that PDF somewhere on your network share. If you're planning to go to SaaS, you can already implement that in CAL, so to store it somewhere, being it Azure Blob Storage, being it OneDrive, but this can be done in CAL. Also, make sure to do cleanup. If you, while doing a development, if you see a unused variable, if you see a unused function, make sure to delete those. You don't want to transfer those into AL and then get a warning saying that this variable is unused. The biggest challenge is handling the modified objects. So you cannot make any breaking changes to the Business Central, especially if you're going to SaaS. So if you have deleted or modified a key, that will have to be reverted. Sometimes if you partners create a key just for calc sums or just for sorting order, this is not necessary for Business Central, so you can easily revert those changes. Also, there are some changes that are incompatible with the Business Central. Most often, it's setting a standard nav or Business Central field to be not editable. So you have to think of how to re-implement that. So you cannot modify such property in Business Central. So either you are leaving yourself with a base app modification, or maybe you can, I don't know, create a copy of that field and only use that field that you can set to not editable. Really important is to reduce your code footprint. Usually we think about moving to an event, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you can't move stuff to event. Moving to event gives you a clear indication of what global variables are you using from the standard object, what local functions are you using. If that's not possible, make sure to move your code to the start or the end of the trigger. If there is a lot of code, create a function, move all your code to a function, and make a call at the end or the start of the trigger. This way you will see much clearer that there is a code modification, but it should be refactored. So I've already mentioned refactoring, and as for refactoring, make sure to remove any legacy code. This is quite an often situation in the products that have been created a long time ago, that have evolved over multiple versions. And more often than not, you will have the functionality that nobody in the company knows what it's doing, or is it even used at all. So it is probably best practice, if you don't know what the code is doing, do not move it to AL. So you can, in CAL, you can just mark it as unknown. You can remove it and see if it is actually used, because you will push it to the production at some point. For any fields you have added, for any controls you have added, including separators on the pages, you have to have affix as well. The same goes for centralizing all the things that you will need to refactor later on. So most often the question is, what do we do with the post and code units? What do we do with the reports? How do we handle those changes in our applications? So not a lot of options. Most obvious one is use events, and by events, not only the standard ones, but you can create custom ones. We'll talk about that later on. Refactoring. Maybe after the refactoring, you will be able to use the standard events. Have a look in that. remove unused code. This is really mandatory, because if you have a lot of code, it's a mess and it takes a lot of time trying to figure out, can this be moved to an actual event? Part of the refactoring would be revert to standard. I mentioned the keys already, and some other things like if you have commented out the standard code, these will never ever be moved to an event. If you have conditional statements that you are executing the standard business logic according to your custom functionality, so this will have to revert it to standard, and you will have to actually refactor your code. There is no other way. There is an option, basically cloning an object. This is most used with the reports. So if you have modified any standard report, move it to your custom range, treat it as your object, and later on in AL, you can use substitute report event just to print your report instead of a standard one. This does not apply to the posting code units, because cloning those would make no sense. Those would just give additional overhead in the maintenance. But for reports, for XML ports queries, that's quite an easy solution. So when we are talking about events, again, most obvious one is to use the standard ones if they suit our needs. What if they don't? For one, have a look at the future versions of the Business Central, including the Insider version, which is the upcoming version, which isn't even released now. You can actually take that event, if it's compatible with older version, and move it to your application. What does that give us? At your application level, this would be a base app modification, but once you have done an upgrade to the latest version, you will have no problems, because your subscriber will already be listening to the event. You can also create a completely custom event, which you should do instead of actually writing the whole code in the, let's say, posting code unit, and request that for Microsoft to create that event on GitHub. If your project, if your solution is large, it will take you quite some time to do an actual upgrade. And by the time you have finished your upgrade, it's really big chance that Microsoft would have already placed that event into the standard Business Central. So you are good to go with your customization being in the extension. A separate topic is, especially when you are going, if you're planning to go to the cloud version, is what you should look into when getting ready. So probably one of the most important topics is translations. Make sure that all your controls or your objects, all your fields have English United States translation. In Business Central, The translations are decoupled from the code, and managing those translations is quite difficult. So if you have everything ideally in place, you will have no problems on supporting your app in the Business Central in AL for multiple localizations. Another thing, application areas. For role-tailored client, those were just recommended. For Business Central in AL, those are mandatory. If you do not specify an application area on a control, it won't be actually visible in the web client. And even worse, it won't be executed. Quite recently, Microsoft introduced a new code analyzer to AL that looks for missing tooltips. I've never seen a solution that would be in the old nav version that would be using that. This was just like a good practice, but nobody actually catered for it. You will have to start thinking about populating the tooltips as well. This can be done in CIL. Microsoft is pushing to make small setups to be populated using wizards. You can do that as well if you have in your solution some setups that are just like 4-6 fields. You could create a wizard and use that instead of a regular setup for the user to set up your application. Wizards, again, they can be created in CAL in the language that you are familiar with, and later on converted. Once you have done everything, you want to convert your solution to AL, so that would be using text to AL tool executable, which is the only tool that actually takes the old version of text files and converts them to AL. It is being shipped with Business Central 14, so Business Central 2019 release wave 1. I have checked, and for the Business Central 15, for the release wave 2, it still can be found under the legacy DLLs, but as far as I know, Microsoft is recommending to use the version 14. So text to AL can be used with either deltas, which would generate you the actual table and page extensions, or the whole objects. The problem with using text to AL is that you might run it multiple times, because if you have modified the code unit, you will have a code unit delta, which cannot be converted to an actual AL object. So you will have to take the manual, you will have to manually take that text file for the code unit and convert it to AL. So that might involve multiple iterations when converting everything. We use, and we suggest you have a look into, using nav container helper. It makes converting the solution a lot easier. So you just create a new container with your base version. You export all the objects to AL. You import your solution, and you export everything as either just modified objects as AL or everything as AL. So once you have converted everything to AL, you can start merging objects with the BC version you are aiming for. The general principles apply, the only difference is the language. So you would have to export the base objects, the version you're currently on, export the modified objects, so that means your existing solution, export the target version you are aiming for, and do a three-way merge. Good thing about using nav container helper, all three steps, all three exports can be automated. You can actually create a PowerShell script. If I remember correctly, Freddy Christensen, the creator of Nav Container Helper, has the complete script in his blog that you would just run, grab yourself a cup of coffee until it finishes, and after that, you would just have to merge the differences. Once you have converted your solution to AL, you have to think of how to move later on. So we suggest you split your code into separate folders by the functional area. This way you have less objects to work with, which will be easier. Imagine that you have 200 pages in one folder compared to 5 folders split by functional area. That would have 200 pages each. This could also result in splitting your big solution into multiple apps. This shouldn't be done just because you can, but if you see a benefit, you should definitely consider breaking your app into multiple ones. So this will limit the impact of the breaking changes that Microsoft introduces. If you have 1,000 objects and Microsoft introduces one breaking change, your whole solution is not compatible. If you have multiple dependent apps, maybe just 1 or 2 apps will be incompatible while the rest is completely fine. You can segregate the development. It's as I mentioned, it's a lot easier to handle 200 files in the folder compared to 1,000 files. You can focus on the separate apps that are used the most, and that gives you ability to install and sell those apps separately on AppSource if you're going to the AppSource. So what's next? So first of all, you have to estimate on how much have you modified the existing Microsoft Nav version. It might be quite difficult to do because you can't actually see what keys you have modified, what keys you have removed, what keys you have created, unless you do a compare on object by object basis. Once you have the list of what you have changed, you can start refactoring. As I mentioned, this should be done in CIL as much as possible, just for the purpose of testing, just so you are not limited by the new functionality of AL or the new behavior of AL. Do the cleanup. Really important thing is, once you decide to move to AL, every single new development or bug fixes or any new code that you write should be done with a thought in mind on how to actually this will be converted to AL. So before you start developing something, look if there's an event subscriber that you have created, or if there's an event subscriber that Microsoft has created in the future versions. After everything, you can easily convert to AL, eliminate the rest of the issues, and you will be and you will have completely working AL app. We have covered most of these topics except for the estimate, and for this I would like to show you the CAL2 extensions analyzer report. This is the report that we are using with our partners when we are doing add-on to extension scoping workshops. So you can get this report from our portal. You would upload your solution. You would upload any third-party solutions that you depend on, and you would be presented with something like this. We are constantly improving, so I'm not entirely sure if this is like the latest version that I have. So first of all, we have split every single problem that our tools have found into two areas, so CAL and AL. So if we now have a look at CAL, so these are the things that you could do while maintaining your app before even moving to AL. So that means convert, move to custom events, move to existing events, solve incompatibilities, and so on. For you not to manually look through every single object, if there's an event that we have missed, we have this resolution, suggested resolution called move to existing events. And if we have a look here, we can see in the closest available event publishers that the modification that was found, it's one line of code before insert event, and there is absolutely no code between your modification and the end of the trigger. That means you could easily identify that these things would be, that you could transfer these things to on after insert event. Other things that you want have a look into. For example, as I mentioned, cleanup, because we don't have any way of knowing what's unused in CAL until we actually delete it. So for cleanup, we can see that, yep, we have a bunch of local variables, global variables that are unused, which is nice for the maintenance. Modification in standard queries, standard reports. So that means we can actually take those objects and move them to our range, make them our own. As for refactoring, I think in this version I had the dialog used. Yeah. So we have a dialog type of variable used in, we can see here the full list of objects. This would fall under the refactoring category. We have to look into why is it used and how do we substitute it. Moreover, if we have a look at these columns, these are the rough estimates based on our experience on how long it would take to resolve one issue or another. So just by looking at this, you can have a rough estimate on and create a timeline on how long would it take for you to fix everything. Yeah, so for example, here we have a 30-minute estimate, which is moved to a custom event publisher. So if we have a look at the issue, we see that we have a code in the function that does not exist. That means 30 minutes includes not only creating an actual event publisher and event subscriber, but also the time needed to create a proper request on GitHub in order for Microsoft to probably introduce such event in the future versions of Business Central. So thank you again for attending. I hope it was useful, and see you in the next webinar. Goodbye.